Hello, everyone. Welcome. Let's give a big round of applause to all the people who served us lunch and put this entire conference together. We should acknowledge them. And I want to start by just pointing out that I have my father in the audience, my dad, Sree Sreenivasan, former ambassador. Wave, Dad, wave, right in front. He's on his 5th book fair in the last month, which tells you something about a new India where books and lit fests are so common. And he wrote his 11th book for on his 80th birthday. And that's incredible. So well done, Dad. Folks, we're here with this amazing panel to talk about some really important issues about a country that is shaping and helping shape the world. Before I turn to my esteemed panelists to share some thoughts, I want to say about JLF that in America, there are 5 JLF USA conferences, festivals, and some of you have been to those. At those, we tell everybody, come to the mothership, come to Jaipur and see the magic. So here I'm going to do the opposite and say, come to America in September and see the magic there, what JLF does, and the conversations we have there. They're very inspiring. So hope all of you will, if you're able to, come in September to JLF USA. The way I look at our topic of a new America, I want to say that the JLF USA is an example of the new America, an example of an America that's become more diverse, more accepting of people from around the world, and where we see change on a regular basis. Of course, with the coming in of the new presidency and the new administration, things that we took for granted, we can't take for granted anymore. As you think about the scope of this topic, we want to look at everything from politics to entertainment and more. And as we do that, I want to leave you with one idea, that some of the most progressive things that have happened in America, and I'll give you a list: amnesty in 1986 under Ronald Reagan, the EPA under Richard Nixon, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the first Earth Day, the seatbelt laws that made it possible to have seatbelts were done also under Ronald Reagan, and there were the same kind of skepticism that we saw about vaccines we saw there, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was launched under President George H.W. Bush. These are examples of America changing and very important opportunities for the world to learn from America on these topics. And they were all done under conservative Republican administrations. So with that, we're going to turn to Kal Penn to share his thoughts with us. Kal, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, everybody. Yeah. How's everybody? Good afternoon. I will second what you said, Sree, and please come to JLF in the States if we let you in. Which is a good segue to sort of talk about, look, I've had the privilege of, I'm mostly an actor, I mostly work in entertainment, I've dabbled a little bit in American politics. And I think what I was going to say when we were talking backstage is, for those of us who are American born and raised of immigrant parents, as an entertainer, I was constantly reminded of the lack of faces that looked like mine when I was a kid on TV. I'm a little younger than the people who I looked up to. There were exceptions like Sarita Chowdhury and Ajay Naidu and people who I could sort of identify with. But what's really interesting, especially over the last 10 years in American entertainment, is the advent of streaming. Maybe it's even a little longer than 10 years. And streaming shows and productions from the perspective of artists have really offered us a chance to enter worlds and tell stories that the linear advertiser-driven model had tended to shy away from. So it used to be, if you're a TV show that's selling ad space, well, you're going to base your show sort of on something that might have made money last year. So it's backward-looking instead of forward-looking. And so the subscriber-based streaming model really offered shows and productions that we certainly I wouldn't have dreamed of when I was 15 years old. And there are a couple of things that are, I think, important to note, especially, like you mentioned, we're dealing with a new administration. There's a lot of conversation about things like diversity and DEI. And when diversity was kind of added with this streaming model, it was because there was an opportunity to tell these stories. And what streaming did was it proved the archaic way of looking at race and representation as what it is, which is a backward-thinking notion. So when you have shows that are diverse, it's not just for the sake of actors who look like me, it's also for audiences that wouldn't have the chance to see stories that are finally being told. And those shows tend to do very well, and they're very profitable in the box office, and they've proven a lot of these old school Hollywood executives wrong. That's a wonderful thing. I think it also makes America more competitive. It makes us better at doing business. It makes us better at dealing with each other and dealing with our friends around the world. So I'm really curious to see how the private sector responds to sort of the saber rattling and maybe even a mandate from the incoming administration. It's a big TBD, but I remain hopeful just because of how audiences tend to respond, which is usually outside of politics.
And Kal and I were on a panel many years ago where the topic was what would happen to pirated DVDs, and you were talking
I still
about
got
that.
beef with pirated DVDs, man.
For another topic,
Yeah,
for
yeah,
another
exactly.
time. All right. Ijeoma, please share your thoughts.
I think that we are in a time that is new and also something that we have seen many times before. And I think that especially right now where we are at the beginning of this administration in the United States, we're in a time where people are being deliberately traumatized and shocked and scared into inaction. And so what I want us to remember, and I think this is so important for me as a Black American, but I think for any population that has been deliberately marginalized by the state, is that we have seen this, we have seen worse than this, and we have come together and pushed through. And that is always the case. And so we're at a time right now where the powers that be are trying to divorce us from our history and trying to make it seem like we cannot withstand and we cannot fight back. But I would not exist if that were the case, and many of us would not exist if that were the case. And so I think it is really vital right now that we actually start looking back into our history of organizing, of collectivism, and bring it into the current, into the now, and what we know now to be more inclusive and to be stronger together so that we can actually not only survive what is to come, because I think we deserve so much more than survival, but push for real, radical, lasting change that will benefit all of us.
Okay, thank you. Ed, you cover diplomacy and diplomatic issues for the New York Times. Your thoughts?
Hi. So earlier this month, I was in Paris with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken on one of his final trips, on his very final trip. And during the question and answer session, the French foreign minister said, "Are we returning to a period where we abide by the law of the jungle?" The answer is yes. And I would say that we probably never left that period, but sometimes it is more pronounced, sometimes it's less pronounced. We're now entering a period where it's much more pronounced. America, I believe that in America, whether it's a Republican or a Democratic administration, the overarching goal of foreign policy is to maintain American primacy, dominance, and hegemony around the globe. Now, in certain Democratic administrations, they might use the language of liberalism and have some, so-called liberal policies to partly advance that objective of American primacy. But under the Trump administration, they're going to do away with all of that. Like they say we don't really need any of that. Basically, all we need to do is project raw power and strength. And one example is that Trump's first major foreign policy act was to halt all foreign aid that the U.S. gives out around the world. So it's affected global health programs, humanitarian programs here in India, in Africa, and many other places around the globe. And their argument is, well, why are we helping all these other countries? We can use the money to bolster American interests within our own borders. And and I think that, all of this is a result of rising multipolarity in the world, that we now live in a multipolar world where America is no longer the unquestioned superpower, but there's an effort to rejuvenate the American empire, and this is one way in which Trump and his followers are trying to do it, and that we're also living still in the aftermath of the impact of September 11th and the disastrous American wars that followed after that. So I think what we're seeing now going into the second Trump administration is we're going to see them try and rejuvenate the American empire in the form of control over the Western Hemisphere. I think they want basically an extended Fortress America that encompasses the territories above them in some manner. Greenland, notably, they've been talking about. Trump has made jokes about Canada being part of America, and then he's very serious about the Panama Canal, and they obviously want to extend a much greater influence over Latin America. And what that might mean is that they will sort of entrench themselves in this idea of the American sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, and then perhaps there will be different spheres of influence that are carved up in the world among other powers. And the other notable thing, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is that Trump's style of engagement with the world is to do one-on-one diplomacy with foreign leaders, and he's particularly attracted to authoritarian leaders, people like Xi Jinping of China, Vladimir Putin of Russia, Kim Jong-un of North Korea. Whatever you think of Modi, apparently he's plans to make a trip next month to the White House to engage with Trump, and Trump's already been talking with Modi in their conversations about issues like trade, immigration. I think Trump plans on deporting a lot of Indians who are undocumented immigrants in America back to India on flights, and that's one of the issues that come up. And these are all emblematic issues that we'll see playing out throughout the administration.
Thank you. There have been talk of 18,000 undocumented immigrants being sent home, but there are 720,000 plus undocumented Indians in the United States. So that's something to note. And when you were saying above America, he's also planning an Iron Dome like they have in Israel to keep America safe is what he wants to do. We heard a little bit about health, and Tom, you and I were on a panel about vaccines and how do we think about that. So you have some thoughts on a new America in the health space. No. Can you switch with?
Is this better? Perfect. First of all, it's an honor to be here. Thanks so much to the audience and the organizers. So we just talked a little bit about undocumented Americans, the newest Americans, and the topic of health. This is a hot issue in the United States, both the question of immigration, but also this intersection between public health and migration was the way that we controlled our borders in the U.S. during the pandemic, and has been one vehicle by which the new administration has thought about trying to control migration, is to look at links to health. As a child of two refugees, the health of migrants is a particular interest of mine, and it's a complicated story. So the reality is that migrants are not, generally speaking, the way by which outbreaks spread. There was a study done in in Nature, looking at genetic sequences and how new variants of COVID spread throughout Europe and spread in the United States. It's primarily business travelers and tourists that spread outbreaks, not migrants, because the former category travels more widely, travels more frequently, and is more the way by which it spreads. In fact, generally, as a matter of health, migrants contribute to better health in the United States rather than take it away. They do this by the fact that when you look at Latino populations, they tend to have a higher life expectancy than white populations in the US. That's the contribution of migrants by and large. Healthier, better diets, and for that reason tend to have higher life expectancy despite being lower income, having less educational attainment, still maintain that. Migrants also contribute by paying more taxes than they take out of the healthcare system, again, by and large, a younger population. And of the US Nobel Prize winners in engineering, in medicine, in chemistry, 40% are immigrants, including some Indian American Nobel Prize winners as well. So they make all these contributions. They are, however, very vulnerable to US policy. And what we saw in the pandemic is that immigrant populations that live in crowded housing, are essential workers, have less access to health care, died at significantly higher rates from COVID-19 than the broader population. We are, as some of you may have heard, in the midst of a potential outbreak from bird flu, avian influenza, and these issues of how the incoming administration extends healthcare to this migrant population, to immigrants more broadly, is going to come to the fore.
Thank you, folks. I'm going to ask them a couple of questions, and we're going to get to your questions, so please get ready to ask. I want to ask Kal, you have some experience in the administration. You were in the Obama administration, and you were also a major character in the administration that was portrayed in Designated Survivor on Netflix that people can find. Tell me what you have seen so far in the 10, 15 days that we've had of this administration. What are the things that tell you things are different? And what should we be watching for?
So I've been abroad for most of it, gracefully. But I think a few things are from in the Obama administration, I worked on youth outreach and youth engagement. And one of the jarring things, I think, is seeing how quickly a lot of us are feigning shock. The incoming administration, President Trump was very clear during his first term on what his goals were, and he really achieved a lot of those goals. Every Republican president has tried to repeal Roe v. Wade, and he succeeded at being the catalyst to do that. So if you're a conservative, I don't think there's a much more successful president you can point to than Trump. He obviously has the kind of bluster that previous Republican presidents
ending affirmative action
didn't have. Exactly, yeah. And so I don't know that we should be shocked. Mm-hmm. I think we should, to your point, I think we should take stock of our communities and the resources that we have. And still, my belief that most people are decent people who are willing to do the right thing for your neighbors. That tends to be something that's lost when conversations are only had digitally. This was something that when I worked in the Obama administration, it was really the advent of Twitter and social media as a tool for spreading information or now misinformation. So those are big red flags, but I also think there's an opportunity there to still continue to push and to do the right things within our communities. So that's kind of what I'm seeing is why are we pretending to be shocked when we knew that this is what the promise was.
And there was even a book that they wrote,
Right,
Project 2025, where all of this was outlined, 900 pages.
Right.
You were talking about communities, and I live in New York City, and New York State, of all the states in America that moved towards Trump, the largest percentage rise was in New York State. And that tells you it's broader of how Latinos moved, African Americans, all still certainly nowhere near majorities, but it's raised an issue, Ijeoma, that can you address how people who are affected negatively by some of these policies, so many more of them voted for some of these policies?
I think a lot of times people are always asking, why are people voting against their best interest? And I think it's so important that we actually define what people's best interests are, because that is determined by the individual. And what I really think where we're at right now is your definition of power and success in the world. And if you have a relative definition of power and success, which is what white supremacist patriarchy is built off of, then that means that you only feel powerful if you are more powerful than someone else. And so what we really are seeing right now, especially as resources become drained at this stage of capitalism that we're in, is a threat as we see people becoming, at least on the surface level, more equal to that particular definition of power. And so there is an idea in the United States that, one, the United States is powerful because it is more powerful than other countries. It is wealthy because it is more wealthy than other countries. And within the US, white men in America are powerful because they are more powerful than people who aren't white men. They are wealthy because they are wealthier than people who aren't. So when you put it in that context, you're not voting against your best interest if someone says, I promise no matter how bad it gets, you'll be doing better than them. And that's what we have a candidate saying. And we've seen this. We've seen studies. We've seen interviews. If you read books like Dying of Whiteness, you'll see interviews with people who are literally dying of cancer because of the lack of health care. And they said, would you rather have health care? And they said, not if it means that undocumented people will get it. Right? So when that is your definition of best interest, is that you go to bed at night and you say, at least I'm not them, then you are voting for your best interest. And so I think part of what we need to see is a shift in how we define power, how we define community, how we define success. And that without that mindset shift, we're going to be competing even more violently for fewer and fewer resources as time goes by.
One of the things that we have seen is that the richest people in America, including folks like Rupert Murdoch and now a lot of the tech bros, have convinced the poorest people in America that other poor people are their enemy. And they've been doing that on Fox News, but now all of these platforms are heading in that direction. Ed, I'd like to ask you, as you look at withdrawal from WHO, the talk about Greenland, talk about Canada, talk about Panama Canal, how do you address and cover these as diplomatic stories when diplomacy is not necessarily going to be the way he leads, where Trump leads?
All right, we'll share these mics. So I actually disagree with that statement. I do think Trump engages in diplomacy. As I was saying, it's a very particular style of diplomacy. He himself wants to engage personally with many of these leaders.
Like a transactional.
Right,
like
very transactional and very, right, and he sees himself as a business person who can close the deal. And when in the first Trump administration, I covered his efforts at doing one-on-one diplomacy with Kim Jong-un of North Korea and went to Vietnam where the deal fell apart, but he made an effort to do that. I'm not saying that that's like the preferred route, but I'm just saying that it's a form of diplomacy that usually other administrations don't engage in. I would say that I think what you're saying is that his talk of expansionism, of sort of neocolonialism, in a sense, is undiplomatic to many other countries. And I think we saw what happened with the 2 flights where he was trying to deport immigrants or migrants to Colombia, and Colombia wouldn't take these 2 military flights coming from the US. And then Trump said publicly to the Colombians, if you don't take these flights, I'm going to impose massive tariffs on you. And I'm going to impose visa bans on your officials. And then the Colombian leaders then said, okay, we're going to take these flights. Or they said, we'll come to Washington and discuss this issue with you. So yes, Trump doesn't engage in diplomacy in the way that you see other American administrations do, but he has his own style. And in a way, some people say it is more reflective of American and of the way that America actually exercises power overseas, but often in some other administrations disguises the way it exercises power. I think for a lot of, I've been to a couple panels here at this festival where there was talk about the war in Gaza, and it's clear that many people in this audience think that America has acted hypocritically in terms of its support for Israel in that war. And I think that some people who are critics of that war say, at least in the Trump administration, you're going to see him exercise power without the pretense of the liberal values that certain leaders put on.
And you're referring, of course, to adventures and misadventures of the CIA going back decades as an example of Americans doing these, interfering in the world already.
Right. I mean, and I'm not trying to put like any normative value on any of this. I'm just saying that these are all things that happen in history, and these are all things that are happening now. We have to take stock of it. I'm also not saying that this is, if you're looking at it from the point of view of American strategists, what Trump does might actually weaken America if you believe in American power. It may not strengthen America, but this is his view of how to do it.
Tom, can you talk a little bit about America's preparedness for the next pandemic, whether it's bird flu or anything else? We've seen 300 million poultry birds culled or killed because of the current situation? Where are we right now with the healthcare system? And what will happen if Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is a known anti-vaxxer and has questioned almost everything about what we know about healthcare, public health in America? Can you talk about that, please?
Great. I want to build a little bit on that question on Ed's remarks about how U.S. foreign policy has changed. So in the area of global health has always been associated with colonization and conquest. Even when you think about our malaria interventions were from British colonialists abroad. The first international vaccine campaign was done by the Spanish, carried in the arms of 26 orphans across the ocean, and then harvested from them in order to vaccinate populations to win hearts and minds. We are at a brief moment, though, during the George W. Bush administration where this component of winning hearts and minds certainly was at the forefront of why we engaged in global health, particularly in the context of the Iraq War. But there was also this sincere view, amidst this unipolar moment, of the morality of saving people from what should be either a set of preventable or treatable diseases. Over time, that has waned in the United States. Global health funding flatlined in the Obama administration. It has gone down. It was also flatlined in the first Trump administration. It went down during the Biden administration and is likely to go down further. This honest conversation about what the U.S. gets out of these engagements and how we work in the partners has been long with other countries, is long in coming, and in some ways may be a good thing. How this ties to your good question about bird flu is I think we're in the midst of a recalibration of how we engage around health globally that may benefit from more transparency and more naked self-reliance for the participants on how we work together and what we get out of it, more transactional basis. And that will be important. Where we are domestically, my fear is that for respiratory pathogens, much of what makes us safe in the early days when there's no effective vaccine, no effective medicine to treat these things, is our willingness to take measures like wearing masks, staying at home, washing our hands, to keep not only ourselves safe, but the more vulnerable amongst us safe. I'm afraid during the pandemic we've moved backwards on those issues. So I worry, it keeps me up literally at night to think about what would happen if we had a bird flu pandemic, particularly amidst this political turmoil we have in the US right now.
Thank you. We're going to go to audience questions, so please raise your hand. The mics will come around. While we're waiting, Kal, any reaction to the things you've been hearing so far?
I mean, a lot of this made me think of you had this election question, and I think, I deal mostly with young people and young voters, and I'll paraphrase my friend Zoran Mamdani, who's running for mayor of New York City. We had an event with him a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about what you said about the jump in Trump voters in the state of New York. It was the double digits, the largest in the country. And he was saying, his view, which I share, is that the Democrats, particularly the Biden-Harris administration or Harrison-Walz, didn't necessarily offer voters solutions that would affect their families, whether it was healthcare, whether it had to do with wages or climate, and for her to sort of say, I'm going to do nothing different than what Biden did, knowing that he wasn't particularly popular with folks who were having trouble putting food on the table when prices were up 20%, I think didn't serve them necessarily well. So I would be in the bucket that says we need bolder, more progressive ideas from the left if we want a point of view that's going to win voters back.
So the name he mentioned, Zoran Mamdani, many of you have not heard it. He's the son of Mahmoud Mamdani, a well-known Indo-African Columbia University professor, and Mira Nair, the director. So you're going to hear his name. He's running for...
That's why I'm really biased.
He's running for mayor of New York from an extreme left. He's a democratic socialist.
Yeah, he's the farthest left.
Yeah, farthest left. All right, let's go to the questions. Short questions and short answers, please. We have a lot of hands up. Thank you.
My question is for Kal, and I'm asking this question because you have experience in White House. During Obama time and not designated survivor time. My question is, do you think in 2025, America will benefit if it goes back to how it was during 80s and 90s when there was a lot of bipartisan bills that was passed and Democrats and Republican Party was like a big camp and there were like a lot of agreements between them rather than just rallying behind just one leader, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the polarization, which is sort of what you're getting at, is at an all-time high now, and there have been a number of books throughout the years. There's one called The Big Sort by Bill Bishop that I think came out in the early 2000s or mid-2000s that predicted, had the analytics to say our communities are going to get more and more polarized. That doesn't serve anybody well, and I think you're going to see that pendulum continue to swing farther and farther until folks can come to a consensus. But I also do think that there are realistic things that we can come to a consensus on. I'm not necessarily hopeful that we'll get there in the next 4 years, but I'd love to be proven wrong.
Ijeoma, thought on that?
Yeah, I just want to point out, though, we don't get where we are with Trump without the 80s and the 90s working the way that they are, right? Without the Reagan administration destroying all of the social safety nets we had, with Clinton actually following up on that and destroying the welfare program as we know it, with wars that killed over 1 million brown people, right? With the destruction of our civil liberties in the name of, protecting America. All of that gets us where we are today. And so I think it's really important that we recognize and appreciate, not in a good way, but appreciate the steps it takes to where you get to where we're at, this more authoritarian, sectarian type government, because we get there with these small steps that have been demonizing black and brown people, undocumented people, since the 80s and onward. And this project didn't start with Trump. This project started with Reagan. And it's really important that we recognize that because there are future projects starting right now. And just the other day, someone was saying that they missed the Bush years and Bush seems friendly compared to whom? To the people that he was dropping bombs on? To the people who lost all their civil liberties through all of these acts passed in the name of security that are now being used to lock people up today, to the normalization of demonizing people from the Middle East, right? Of Islamophobia throughout our culture. It is so important that we recognize how we get where we are, not just what it looks like right now.
Thank you. One of the things that most Indians wouldn't know is that Ronald Reagan started his campaign by helping to erode the trust in government. He said the scariest words in America are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." And I think in countries like India and other places, there's still an understanding that government has a role to play. Whereas in America, millions, tens of millions of people will tell you that anything to do with the government is just bad to begin with. Let's keep going with questions, please.
We haven't discussed about the climate change policies that Trump administration is going to.
Okay, so Ed, you want to start us on that?
The question, I'm sorry, it was
Climate
about
change.
climate change. Yeah, so, Trump has demonized climate change policies. He's been very overt about it, he and his allies, and they're saying that what they're planning to do is dismantle the various climate policies throughout all the agencies of the U.S. government. Already in this withdrawal of foreign aid or the suspension of foreign aid, they've said that certain groups that work on foreign aid have said that they've been told that any climate change programs that they have overseas will be cut off permanently, that aid will not restart. So it's, and then of course you saw Trump withdraw from the Paris Agreement, which he did in the first administration too. So I think it's very clear what direction he plans to take this. And there's a question of whether the private sector in the U.S. will go along with this, or whether they will then try and step up and be more proactive on climate change initiatives. I think a lot of that will depend on where they see the market going. A lot of the U.S. is driven, as you know, by market forces and the perception of profits. And if the companies feel that there is some benefit to following climate initiatives, they might pick up some of the slack. But from the government side, the federal government side, they're definitely clamping down on climate resilience policies. Also, on the state level, you'll see certain states like California trying to ramp up their own policies to make up for some of the shortfall.
Yeah. Right. Question? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. A lot of us non-Americans were actually shocked when the American public elected Trump. Normally we see leaders with that kind of narrative getting elected in countries which are very poor, where you have a coup every other year. But however, the narrative in the media, especially the American media, was anti-Trump. They were trying to project the image that somehow he'll find a way to lose. We see that a lot of the people whom we spoke about today, blacks, Hispanics, Indians, all move towards him. So what are we missing? I mean, what is the actual reason that he won? Are we missing the real reason why people voted for him? And he actually won by a fairly large margin.
Okay, so thank you for that question. I'll just clarify that he had the 11th smallest victory in the history of the United States. He did not get 50%. And I think the hopeful thing for people looking at a big tent and progress in America is that in multiple states where there were items on the ballot, issues on the ballot, even when they voted for Trump at the presidential ticket, they voted for progressive issues on the on those ballot items. So the mandate that he has claimed and that the media has amplified isn't exactly where I think it is. So Tom, I'd like to ask you how you look at this in terms of what is it that people missed in terms of the Trump victory?
So I think two things are clear from the polling. People were very dissatisfied with the cost of living in the United States and the economic performance in addressing that cost of living. And there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the level of immigration in the US. The only thing I would point out here is the US is not unusual in either of those regards in terms of there being political debate about inflation and economic performance or how best to harness or control or what should be the future of immigration. So I think that is an issue moving forward. That said, he's obviously tapped into a well of dissatisfaction in the US, particularly among people who are not college educated. He did very well across all racial groups in people without a college education in the US. And I think it's important that we listen to that signal and we think about how to address the people that needs haven't been met in prior administrations and moving forward.
Okay. Anyone else want to follow up? Go ahead.
I think it's really important to remember that people want to vote for something. And I think that was not offered to people on the left this election. The truth is that Biden ran on not being Trump. And when Trump was president and unpopular, that worked. But that only works once. Because if you run on not being Trump, and then you fund a genocide, and then you don't really do anything to help everyday people, and you build cop cities all over the country, and you help crack down on dissenting college students, what are people going to vote for next time when the next candidate says, I too will not be Trump? What does that mean? And so we saw a lot of people staying home. A lot of people who felt in good conscience they had nothing to vote for. And when we look at those numbers, what we see is people want to vote for something. And time again, when Harris was asked, what will you be? The answer was not Trump and a light Republican. And that left a lot of voters out in the cold. And at some point, you have to say, when do you pay for making such bad choices? And I think a lot of voters said, at some point, we're tired of being held hostage by a party that says, if you don't vote for us, regardless of how much you dislike us, you're going to get this guy. And all we promise is we won't be this guy. And a lot of voters decided, you can only pull this on us so many elections before we say, then you lose. Come to us with something to vote for, and we'll vote for you. And I think this was one of the worst campaigns that we've seen in a long time when it comes to actually motivating people to have something to vote for.
Yeah.
I agree with all of that. I'll just add one small thing on the youth front is, you'd mentioned the American media. Most young people are not getting their news or information from CNN, Fox, or MSNBC. They're getting it from podcasts and social media. And one thing that the Harris-Walz campaign did not do is reach young people where they're at. So Trump was fantastic going on podcasts like Joe Rogan, who tends to have a base that already agrees with Trump, but Harris refused to do a lot of those engagements, and I think you saw the result of that is people just didn't feel that they were invalidated. They also felt like she wasn't comfortable reaching out to people who may not agree with her on whatever she stood for, which still isn't really clear.
To underline that, the media in India, you all see hundreds of news channels. America has 4 or 5, depending on whether you count the Weather Channel as an all-news channel, and so about 15 million people watch those channels. The population of the country is 330 million, which tells you something about the difference in Indian television and American television. Ed?
Since the topic is on the media right now, I just wanted to say I disagree with one aspect of the premise of the question, which is that people were taken by surprise by the victory of Trump. I think anyone who's following the election, who was following even the polling, which a lot of people, there's a lot of criticism of polling, but if you were following even in general terms of polling and the conversation in the U.S., even in Washington, it was clear that Trump had a very good chance of winning, and that this was the whole reason why Biden decided to step down after the disastrous debate. Like, all the numbers were going against the Democrats. When Harris entered the campaign, there were only a few moments earlier in her campaign when it looked like the polling numbers were favoring her slightly, but even then it was a coin toss. So like, no one's going to put their life savings on the fact that Harris is going to win. It would be foolish to do that. I personally thought there was a very decent chance that Trump would win, and if you were looking at the numbers, they all bore that out. It was all out there for the public.
Last couple of questions. Please go ahead.
Yeah, you said we shouldn't be shocked. One of you said we shouldn't be shocked by what's happening. It's only been a few days, but why don't we see any pushback? The more we kind of normalize, I think this is going to get normalized, don't you think?
Okay, I'd like to take a couple more questions, if you can pass the mic. Do we have another mic to get to this side? Whoever has a mic, please ask the question.
Hi.
Yeah, please.
So, since in India we have a rise of right-wing government, and there has been a wave of ahistoric propaganda movies here, I want to ask you, where does Trump's America stand? Where does the progressive circle in cinema stand? Will it be more restricted? Because here, most movies, most cinema, and even our digital news media works in the interest of billionaires. So, yeah, where does the Trump America stand?
Okay, we'll come to that. Thank you. I'm collecting some questions. Who has a mic, please raise your hand. Go ahead.
My question is
Pass
for
the mic to one more person.
My question is for Edward. With all your long years of reporting on diplomacy, what do you see happening in the Taiwan Strait? We see rearmament of World War II era airfields like Tinian. We see China blockading Taiwan, and we see America rearming the first and the second island chain. And sort of bolstering these alliances, at least under Biden. And the Trump in his last term said that Taiwan defense is not pragmatic. So what do you see happening in the Taiwan Strait in the future?
Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're getting the sign to wrap up. So I'm going to have our folks here give us their final thoughts. I'm going to remind you of the questions on the table. Where is the pushback from the progressives? What is the state of progressive cinema and opportunities? I think that's a question for Kal. We also have a question about Taiwan and what happens there. So Kal, we'll have you give us your final thoughts.
Sure. I will do the disclaimer of saying, as an American citizen who's also applying for his OCI card, I'll be very careful with how I answer that question. I think a lot of it is TBD. I think a lot of the American media companies, sort of like India, but the audiences are a bit different. They're global companies. They've profited tremendously from diversity. That's sort of gone against this Trumpian definition that diversity somehow hurts the bottom line and hurts corporations and hurts our morality. In practice, that's the opposite is true. So I am curious to see whether political pressure will have any weigh in on this, or whether things will continue as they are.
Kal Penn, everybody, give him a hand.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. See you at 5:30 for another session.
Okay.
So I firmly believe that the Democrats and Republicans all want American imperialism and hypercapitalism. It's just that one gets to say it openly and one does not. And one likes to do it overseas while saying, we'll take care of people here. The other one just says, we're not taking care of anyone anywhere except for rich white men. And the problem we're in right now is that the American people most impacted by these policies are more educated than they were before and are coming together than they were before. So the reason why you're not seeing the progressives come together to fight this is because the people who are most impacted want to fight them too, because they now understand how all of these policies are impacting them and understanding how the people that they elected to represent them are not representing them. And so they're really in a bind right now because the language and the lip service they used to give to their progressive values doesn't hold up anymore with a population that can talk to each other outside of news networks and can really talk about the global impact of imperialism and hypercapitalism. And so what you have are politicians who want to maintain power in this very imperialist way while using language that's progressive, and people aren't falling for it anymore. And so right now what people have been asking for with these protests, with these uprisings for Black lives, for Palestinian lives, for workers' rights, they're asking for fundamental policy change, and that was never something that Democrats promised. And so right now, they're not organized because they learned that they don't get our votes when they don't actually do anything, and they don't really know what to do with the educated populace that we have right now. And educated, I mean sharing information across workers, across racial and ethnic groups of people who are directly impacted by US policies.
Thank you. Ijeoma Oluo, please, give her a hand. Ed.
All right, so the question is, are we about to enter World War III? That was the question, right? So there's two parts to your question. One is, in my mind, one is, will Xi Jinping try and attempt an invasion of Taiwan? The answer is, I don't know. The second part is, will the US then try, under Trump, try and get involved militarily if that happens? And I think the verdict's out on that. I think that there are competing interests on China policy around Trump. There are certain China hawks in his administration who will try and continue arming Taiwan, increasing the military presence in the Asia Pacific. There are other people around Trump who say, let's withdraw the American military footprint from the Pacific and concentrate it in the Western Hemisphere instead. There are also the tycoons around Trump, notably Elon Musk, who love doing business with the People's Republic of China and who have said, oh, Taiwan perhaps should be ruled by the Communist Party. Trump himself has said, why are we giving Taiwan all these resources and they're not paying us money for this? So I think there are many competing interests. It's unclear what he would do if the PRC were to try and invade Taiwan.
Ed Wong, everyone. I just want to point out on Monday, Ijeoma and I are going to be on a panel about The Future is Black at 3 p.m. Please join us for that. Tom?
Great. I'll make 3 points. I completely understand the perception of no pushback to the Trump administration because it feels like it's the 65th day of January. This month has gone on so long with all the changes that have happened. But the reality is it's the 30th. We're 10 days in. We've already seen several lawsuits that have, in fact, stopped what the Trump administration has pursued. You just saw that now in terms of a stay put on the hold on federal funding. You've also seen a stay put on the effort to try to restrict birthright citizenship. Both of those have proven that to be effective, both of those that were done by outside organizations. Couple of points on the Taiwan point. I think one thing people might look to is the nominees to the national security and foreign policy positions in the Trump administration tend to be more of a traditional Republican set of appointees. Marco Rubio and Waltz in the national security advisor position. So I think they have favored a more traditional perspective in those areas so far in the nominees. What I do think the question on Taiwan gets to is the world, despite the political turmoil in the US, doesn't stop. There will be significant challenges before us, and I think it is incumbent where the US and other like-minded nations can find reasons to cooperate with one another, and I hope that proves true with the US and India on so many of the areas where they share some interests.
Thank you, Tom. I'll just say we got through this whole thing without talking about Vivek Ramaswamy or Kash Patel, and that's a victory. Thank you very much, everybody.
It has